They cut my row of apple trees down at dawn, 10 years of pruning, grafting, and quiet Sunday mornings, gone before I even had coffee. I remember standing in the yard with dirt under my nails and a clipboard shoved into my face like it was my fault the sun came up. That's where it started. And if you want to know how a quiet man ends up building a wall and changing a neighborhood, you should know I didn't start out looking for a fight. I wanted my trees back. My name's Hank Mercer. I grew up fixing things: porches, tractors, the odd cousin who thought a DIY job was a personality trait, and I like order in my yard because it's the only place I get to keep something just the way I want it. Cedar Hollow was supposed to be the kind of place where people wave from their porches, not where someone slid a bylaw across the table like it was scripture. For years, I tended that row of apple trees in the strip between my driveway and the alley. They were crooked and stubborn and perfect, and people would stop by in the fall for a pie slice and a story. Then Marla Donahue showed up on a Tuesday with a clipboard, a badge that said board volunteer, and a smile that never met her eyes, and she decided the trees violated community sightlines. She didn't ask, she told. "They're an eyesore," she said, like that explained anything. When I asked for the code, she pointed to a faded paragraph in a binder, and when I asked who had signed it, she shrugged like the signatures were irrelevant. The men who'd signed that binder were either dead or busy, and Marla liked it that way. Power, it turns out, works best when it's quiet and unquestioned. 2 days later, the trees were chainsaw sculptures, trunks sawed low and ragged, roots exposed like wounded pride. She stood across the street and took pictures as if this was a public service announcement. After the numbness came the argument, a neighbor in a robe yelling at a woman holding an HOA pamphlet, and then the notice: violation, fine, removal. I wrote letters. I called attorneys who said possible and expensive. I waited for the slow little machines of bureaucracy to churn. People told me to replant, to be reasonable, to smile when someone else dictated your yard. But it wasn't the trees alone, not really. It was the way she looked at me afterward, like my history in that house was an irritation to be trimmed away. It was the way my daughter's pie recipe, my mother's recipe, had become collateral damage in an edict that smelled of control. So I did something unhinged, at least. That's how some woke up to it. I started building. Not out of malice, not out of vandalism, but out of a stubbornness that felt like the only honest response left. I went to the yard store, rented a truck, bought blocks and mortar, and with the first block in my hands, I felt myself shifting into a different person, not a man who took weekends to weed, but a man who would not let his life be rearranged by a committee's whim. I told no one at first, didn't want the meeting room theater, the sympathetic head nods. I wanted the work to be real before it was debated. Word spread anyway. Ray, across the street, wheeled by with his newspaper and a grin. "Hank, you building a fortress?" Mrs. Alvarez brought me coffee one morning and said quietly, "It looks solid." Most people watch from a distance, because fences make neighbors pick a side even if they don't mean to. The wall rose, not high enough to cut off the sun, just high enough to say, "This is mine." It was concrete and stubborn and, in the end, dignified, something I didn't think a pile of gray blocks could be, until I stood back and saw the line it drew between what I'd lost and what I chose to keep. Marla didn't like lines. She sent a letter, then a lawyer's notice, then a citation stapled to my mailbox like a gauntlet. She showed up one afternoon in front of my gate with a small posse of form letters and a voice that had been practicing outrage. "You can't build that without permission," she said. And then, as if she'd saved the world, "You'll have to remove it." I told her I had consulted professionals, that the wall sat entirely on my property, and she smiled in that way that meant the conversation was over because she'd declared it over. The neighborhood forum lit up like a dry creek bed after rain. Debates about property rights, about aesthetic harmony, about what a homeowner owed the community. People sent me messages, both kind and cold. Some said I'd gone too far. Some said I should have done it years ago. Then the meeting came, the kind of evening where fluorescent lights flatten everyone and minutes get turned into memory. The clubhouse was full of people who had, until recently, nodded politely at Marla's reports. She spoke first, with measured outrage about precedent and safety and the need to protect property values. I listened. I could feel my pulse in my tongue, and when it was my turn, I didn't shout, I didn't beg, I just told the story of the trees. The way they were planted by my wife's father, how my mother taught me to graft, how kids used to leave notes on my porch asking if they could pick an apple. I said it plain, no flourish. Those trees were the only thing my mother and I agreed on for 5 years. There was a hush because people heard in that a thing that mattered beyond rules. Marla's response was sharp. This isn't about your nostalgia, she said. This is about community. The room shifted like a tide. Marla had the art of performance down. She curated outrage, timed the gasp, saccharined the empathy. But one by one, neighbors spoke. Ray said he'd always liked the apples. Mrs. Alvarez said her kids had learned to make jam in my kitchen. A woman whose house backed onto my property said quietly that the wall had actually made her feel safer. It's funny how a group will line up to be offended until their own memories are asked to hold the balance. We voted on an appeal, a messy, human thing, less about bylaws and more about who could persuade a room to care. The margin was thin. Marla lost her position on the board by a handful of votes, and, in that same breath, the board agreed to a review of enforcement policies. People who'd been cowed found their voices, and people who'd been indifferent realized they'd been complicit in the easy cruelty of rules applied without thought. The wall stayed, but the satisfying ending isn't tidy. You don't get a parade and confetti because you build something that's yours. The next spring, where the trees had been, I planted new saplings, smaller, careful, hopeful. They were not the same trees. They couldn't carry the same years. They would grow, though, and maybe one day someone would sit on my porch and remember that I once stood in a yard with sawed trunks and decided to do more than grieve. Marla moved away a year later, the kind of detail that sounds like karma but is mostly just life moving on, and Cedar Hollow kept its veneer of quiet even as it shifted under the surface. There were darker things, too. A few people called me stubborn in ways meant to hurt, friends who wanted the peace of not being involved. Someone on the neighborhood chat suggested the wall would reduce our property values. Someone else said it was an eyesore. I read those messages at night and felt old, because you learn that people will project their anxieties onto anything. A fence, a tree, a man who won't fold. But I also learned something simpler, that the rules in a community are as humane as the people who enforce them. And when enforcement becomes a weapon, it's time to change the armorer. If you're watching this and you think I'm a hero, I'll disappoint you. I'm not. If you think I'm a villain, I'll disappoint you again. I'm a man who liked his trees and then watched them taken, and who learned that the only real options were to accept loss, to sue until your savings were gone, or to stand where you are and act. I chose to stand. Maybe that made things worse for my sleep. For a while, I lost nights to worry, to second-guessing whether a line of concrete was worth the social cost. But it taught me that when someone tries to take what anchors you, the polite thing is not always the right thing. People ask what I do differently. I'd talk more to my neighbors before I started stacking blocks. Community is a conversation, not a construction site. I'd have pushed harder for clarity in the bylaws, so one person's taste couldn't be law. And I'd have kept a jar of extra coffee for Ray, because he was the one who brought over the ladder when a storm loosened a capstone and said, "You didn't have to do this, Hank, but I'm glad you did." So what do you think? Was I right to build the wall, to take a messy, stubborn stance for something that mattered only to me at first? Or should I have swallowed the loss and let the trees become a sad story I told over coffee? Is community a set of rules we must follow no matter what? Or is it a living thing we shape with our voices? Drop a comment. Tell me where you stand, right or wrong, legal or emotional. I want to hear the reasons, because that's the point. We argue about what keeps us civil, and in the arguing we learn what the word means. If this touched you, share it with someone who's ever had something they loved taken away. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and come back. There are more stories in the yards of people who don't expect to be heroes, just stubborn enough to keep what's theirs.